Shabbat Shalom. Many of the social and environmental challenges that we're facing as a human race have been heavily politicized. We receive unique sets of data and information based on social media sources that we expose ourselves to, and the presentation of the issues most often are framed with editorial slant. With so much information blasting towards us, how do we make sense of what's real and what's true? Well, it's true that Torah, Bible, or religion can be bent and used to support any opinion on any current social issue. The interpretive process of Jewish law can help us hear the eternal voice of Torah as it goes forth throughout every generation, pointing us to how divine values are expressed in each unique age. From the perspective of Jewish tradition, it's impossible to have a literal fundamentalist reading of the Torah. We only have to engage the text in any kind of serious way to hear the most troubling divine commands, such as the Torah's injunction to kill all the inhabitants of an idolatrous city by sword. Our sages interpreted this and other laws like it so restrictively so that there never was and never will be a case in which the law was applied. For example, Rabbi Eliezer said that if this idolatrous city contained a single mezuzah, then the law was not enforced. According to interpretations like this, these laws were not ever meant to be put into practice, but were written solely so that, quote, we should expound them and receive reward, end quote. They only had an educational, not a legal function. In this case, the very act of interpreting the law to slay the idolatrous city restrictively, by making sure that it could never happen, the sages were given the opportunity to teach about the value of human life over ideology. In the opposite direction, some laws were held to be far more extensive than they seemed at first sight. One striking example occurs in this week's Torah portion. In the course of a war, when one's conducting a siege, one has to be careful not to destroy the trees of the land that it's being taken from because they have fruit or other useful qualities. The prohibition against destroying fruit-bearing trees was known as bal tashchit, do not destroy. Now, on the face of it, this law is highly limited in scope. What do you do in battle? But the sages understood it very broadly as including any act of needless destruction. Maimonides taught that it not only applies to trees, but also whoever breaks vessels or tears garments, blocks a wellspring of water, or destructively wastes food. This law becomes the halachic basis of the ethic of environmental responsibility. This past week, we've had the longest running heat wave in history. We've never had temperatures this high for so many days. Our world is heating up, and the global scientific community agrees in no uncertain terms that our human choices of how we consume play a part. The law of Bal Tashchit obligates us to be engaged with the question of how our choices affect the environment we live in. While this engagement is certainly an educational process, and each of us will decide which choices we can live with, the Torah requires us to engage. Why did the sages narrow the scope of the law in some cases and broaden it in others? While rabbinic literature doesn't have an answer for this, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, the former chief rabbi of Britain, offers a theory. He teaches that the sages always seek to interpret the divine law in a way that is consistent with the total structure of biblical teaching. So in the case of the condemned city, where all the inhabitants were sentenced to death, this law conflicts with the principle of individual justice. Earlier in the Torah, when Sodom was threatened with such a fate, Abraham argued with God that if there were only 10 innocent people, the destruction of the entire population would be unfair. And in the case of Bal Tashchit, there is so much in the Torah that's concerned with sustainability. The sabbatical year to let the land rest, the Jubilee year to release people from debts, the various laws not to interfere with nature through crossbreeding of livestock and fields, not to mention the fundamental purpose of human beings articulated at the beginning of Genesis in relation to nature was le'ovda u'leshomra, to serve it and to guard it. All of these laws point to a general orientation and principle of sustainability. Currently, there is a national movement in our country around racial justice. Black-skinned people and allies are insisting that we get real about the reality of racism in our country and how these stereotypes deeply affect the lives of Black people in almost every sector of our society. While many of us light-skinned Ashkenazi Jews have no idea what it's like to move in the world as a person of color, our history teaches us what it's like to be discriminated against based on our religious and ethnic identity. Our knowledge of what it means to be slaves in the land of Egypt, combined with the Torah's general principle of not standing idly by while our neighbor's blood is being shed, obligates us to listen and learn from the Black experience and to engage with the question of how we can be supportive of the movement. For some of us, it's difficult to be open to listening and adopting a supportive orientation when we hear individual Black voices espouse anti-Semitic or anti-Israel sentiments. And while it's incumbent upon us and other members of the Black community to speak out against these comments, we can't ignore what I believe is the Torah's general principle here, to make sure that our justice system dispenses justice equally so that people of every color and background can feel safe and fully respected for their fundamental humanity. There's a passage in the Talmud that is traditional to recite each morning. It lists a number of mitzvot that give us not only our share in this world, but in the world to come. Included in this list are providing for a marriage, escorting the dead to their resting place, becoming absorbed in prayer, and making peace between people. And then the passage concludes saying, and the study of Torah is equivalent to them all. Talmud Torah keneged kulam. The verb used, keneged kulam, equivalent to them all, is actually difficult to translate. It could mean facing them all or opposite them all. I like to translate it as the study of Torah reflects them all. When we study Torah, beyond looking at individual laws that are so often tied to a specific time and place, fundamental values and general principles become revealed. We become exposed to a deeper vision of what human life and a moral society can really look like. And then, with the support of each other, we can meet the challenge of living this vision in our time and place, here and now. Shabbat Shalom.